Here in Section 10 of Module 3, we're going to get to the part that everybody was waiting for, the U.S. munitions list. So without any further ado, let's jump right in. In our first bullet point, we'll point out that the USML identifies all articles, services, and related technical data that are designated as defense articles and defense services. There are 21 different categories within the USML that help to break down these articles, services, and technical data. Second bullet point, if such articles, services, and technical data appear on the USML, a license approval is required. That's a definitive statement and a little different from what we'll see in the Export Administration Regulations, where there are exceptions and ways to export legally without a license. In the case of the USML, let's state it again. When articles, services, and technical data appear on the USML, a license approval is required. Now, things do change from time to time in the USML, so let's present as a trade tip that any changes in designations on the USML are published in the Federal Register. That could be ongoing changes or also changes that are a result of the ECR, the Export Control Reform Initiative. So you should be checking throughout the year, as a best practice, the Federal Register to see what changes have occurred. Continuing on, and as mentioned just a second ago, under the ECR initiative, many products that were on the USML have been transitioned to the BIS Commerce Control List. We mentioned them previously, we'll mention them again, and we'll see them one more time when we get into the section on the Export Administration Regulations. But they are the 600 series and the 9X515. So for a best practice, you can check the status of articles moved from the USML to the Commerce Control List on this web link here. Appears on this page as well as in our bibliography. So there are a couple of sources that you can check for any changes to the USML. Federal Register, ECFR, and this web link as well. So there are indeed 21 categories within the USML, and we're going to run through each one of them in the spirit of being thorough. So let's begin on the upper left-hand side, and we'll get through them in due course. Category 1, firearms, close assault weapons, and combat shotguns. 2, guns and armament. Category 3, ammunition and ordnance. Category 4, little bit different, but launch vehicles, guided missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, torpedoes, bombs, and mines. So even through the first 4 categories, you can see that we're talking about serious defense matters here that really need to have strict controls around them. Category 5, same mentality applies. Explosives and energetic materials, propellants, incendiary agents, and their constituents. Moving to the right, we see in Category 6, surface vessels of war and special naval equipment. 7 is ground vehicles. We have an example related to ground vehicles, so make a mental note there. Category 8, aircraft and related articles. Category 9, military training equipment and training. Category 9 is an interesting one because we're talking about training equipment as well as the training itself. You'll recall, we've said a bunch of times, we're not just talking about articles, tangible goods under the ITAR, but defense services and technical data. Training is considered a type of defense service. Category 10, protective personnel equipment and shelters. Moving on to our next slide. We can see in Category 11, military electronics. We'll see a little something on that as well. Category 12, fire control, rangefinder, optical and guidance and control equipment. 13, materials and miscellaneous articles. Category 14, changing gears entirely and getting into toxicological agents, including chemical agents, biological agents, and associated equipment. 15 is different. It's spacecraft systems and associated equipment. 16, nuclear weapons, design and testing related items. 17, classified articles, technical data, and defense services not otherwise enumerated. This is a bit of a catch-all category, and you'll note a mention of classified articles. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Category 18, directed energy weapons. 19, gas turbine engines and associated equipment. 20, submersible vessels and related articles, submarines and the like. And then 21, another catch-all, articles, technical data, and defense services not otherwise enumerated. So if you have an article, tech data, or services that likely fall under the USML, but you haven't been able to find it in a different category, 21 might be of some assistance. Let's have a couple of looks at excerpts from the USML. We want to highlight the categories, but also give the student a visual portrayal of what the USML really looks like. Now, students that deal with the USML more than others will have some familiarity here. But for other people who maybe aren't as familiar or perhaps not dealt with the USML at all, this will be especially helpful. So on our left-hand side is Category 7, Ground Vehicles. And although we'll get into the detailed explanation of how the nomenclature works, start to have a look at how these letters are organized, numbers, lowercase Roman numerals. That's important because it designates how the USML is laid out, what's referred to as an alpha paragraph designation. More on that in just a minute. But Category 7 deals with ground vehicles, starting with armored combat ground vehicles in A, with some further distinction. A1 are tanks, A2 are infantry fighting vehicles, and then under B, which is a new section within the category, ground vehicles and trailers that are armed or are especially designed to serve as a firing or launch platform. So a little bit of exposure as to how things are laid out here. Let's move over to the right. Category 9, military training equipment and training. We actually stopped at this category when we were going through all 21 and pointed out how this category incorporates those intangibles, defense services, in the form of training. So as we see here, in A, we're talking about training equipment. In B, simulation devices. In C, tooling and equipment. And as this category continues on, it goes into detail about the training itself. So a good illustration about how we're dealing with tangible articles as well as intangibles, in this case, in the form of training. A couple of other excerpts. Let's have a look at Category 11 on the left, military electronics, starting with A, that is further broken down into 1, 2, and 3. It could be more, but in this case, there are just 3. And then lowercase Roman numerals. This is an example of the nomenclature and how the categories are organized. We'll define it specifically, as we said, in just a few moments. But we're talking about military electronics. That could be anything from underwater sound equipment to underwater acoustic active and passive countermeasures to radar systems. Again, the category goes on into much greater detail, different types of military electronics, but we want to get a look at how things are organized. Same thing for Category 13, materials and miscellaneous articles. In this instance, under A, anything from cameras and specialized processing equipment, to B, information security or information assurance systems, or to B1, military or intelligence cryptographic systems. So different categories, same nomenclature, starting with a letter, lowercase letter, into a numeral, and then potentially into lowercase Roman numerals. So returning to the topic of determining if goods are subject to the ITAR, once we make a determination, be it through a CJ request or order of review tool, we need to be able to classify goods within the USML. That's what we're talking about here. So we're going to assume that our articles are indeed subject to the ITAR. Let's get into some classification activity now. So the first step in classifying goods on the USML is to begin with a review of the item's general characteristics. What is it in general terms? General, fit, form, and function. This first step guides companies to one of the 21 categories of the USML. Once we're in the right category, we have to match particular characteristics and functions to a specific entry in that category, much like we saw, albeit briefly, in the previous examples. We have other examples to come. Let's talk about a concept known as composition of an entry within the categories of the USML. Well, in our first bullet point, we state that within each category, defense articles are enumerated by this alpha paragraph designation. Let's define it as a trade tip. And we talked about it briefly, but let's hit it a little harder now. Alpha paragraph means that the nomenclature begins with a lowercase letter, A, B, C, however many there are, followed by a number, the number 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, if necessary for even further detail, lowercase Roman numerals. We'll see some Roman numeral examples in just one moment. Our designations, as we point out in the last bullet point, may also include subparagraphs to add further definition. The whole idea is to be as specific as possible, make a determination that an article is covered by the USML, get into the right category, and then the specific details on a given article within each category. Second slide on composition of an entry. We should point out, and we have an example that illustrates this, but parts, components, accessories, and attachments are then detailed. So you start with the actual article itself, and then later on in an entry, you'll see about parts, components, accessories, and such. Most categories contain an entry on technical data and defense services for a defense article. And then as a quick trade tip, let's say when we see an asterisk preceding an entry, that denotes significant military equipment. We'll point that out in just one second, but we're talking about, as the name would indicate, very significant pieces of equipment like a tank, an armored personnel carrier, things of that nature. So let's help to illustrate this whole idea about ITAR determination through an industry vertical entitled our ITAR determination exercise, determining where in the USML our article, defense service, or technical data falls. So let's see what we have here. You are a law student who is interning at a firm that specializes in advising clients on defense articles and services. A client that designs radar systems has developed a radio that is specifically designed to interfere with other communication devices. Your boss has asked you to determine if the item falls under the USML, and if so, where. What do you do? Well, the first thing you should do is ask for some help, because as an intern, you shouldn't be doing this on your own. But let's use this as an example. You're a smart law student, and you can figure this out. Well, what do we have here? After reading the ITAR from cover to cover and reviewing the USML, you discover that in general terms, radar systems fall under Category 11, entitled Military Electronics. That was one of our examples. Radios that fit the description given are then found to be located in A43. As such, the item is on the USML and requires a license for export. So that's good, but what does that actually look like? You'll recognize this as Category 11, entitled Military Electronics. What do we have in A? Well, let's read through it. Electronic equipment not included in Category 12 of the USML, which is specifically designed, modified, or configured for military application. You'll recall that terminology when we looked at a CJ request, when we looked at the registration form. These are the types of things that the DDTC are very interested in. Specifically designed, modified, or configured. We have to have that terminology in our mind at all times. So as we go down Category 11, you'll note that A is followed by A1, underwater sound equipment, A2, underwater acoustic active and passive countermeasures, 3, radar systems, maybe we're getting warmer, but if you go down to 4, you'll notice electronic combat equipment such as, and then 1 and 2 we can read through, but when we get to 3, radios, including transceivers, specifically designed or modified to interfere with other communication devices or transmissions. That fits the description of our article. As such, it is an accurate determination. Classification A43. Let's do another exercise. This is another industry vertical coming from the automotive space, and it's an ITAR determination exercise. We have everything up all at once, so we can run through it consecutively. What do we have here? You are the trade compliance manager at a Tennessee-based auto and truck parts manufacturer. Different industry. The company has just entered into a niche business that will provide rotary shock absorbers that are designed for a military vehicle that weighs 50 tons. What is the procedure for determining if these shock absorbers are subject to the ITAR? Through your in-depth analysis, you will discover that because the shock absorbers are for a military vehicle, the article is covered by Category 7. By following the alpha paragraph designation that we talked about, you will also discover that parts for military vehicles are covered under G. Suspension components are in G10, and rotary shock absorbers are in G10-1. There's that alpha paragraph approach again. So let's have a quick look. It should be becoming a little bit more familiar as to how this classification works, and the alpha paragraph procedure also works. So we know we're dealing with ground vehicles. We're making a part, a rotary shock absorber that goes into a ground vehicle that weighs 50 tons. So we know we're in Category 7. It's important to point out that Category 7 is a particularly long category, so we should point out that we actually cut and paste the specifics to this solution here. This is not a sequential representation of what you see in Category 7. It's designed to isolate the classification that we're looking for. So let's bear that in mind. So the category, like any category, starts out with a letter A, and then you see A1 and A2, and then B, but we had to go down all the way to G to get to parts, specifically ground vehicle parts, components, accessories, attachments, associated equipment, and systems. Under G, there were a series of numbers, 1 through 9. We had to read all the way through 1 through 9 to get to the one we were looking for, which happened to be 10. Suspension components as follows. And then within 10, G10 actually, Roman numeral 1, rotary shock absorbers specially designed for the vehicles weighing more than 30 tons. Well, our vehicle, or at least the vehicle we're selling parts for, weighs 50 tons. So you can see we are indeed in the right category, covered under letter G. Suspension components are in G10, and rotary shock absorbers are in G10-1. So a good example of an industry that might not seem like it has USML applications, but because an article is specially designed, it actually does. So a good example there. We're going to end section 10 here and pick up in section 11 on actual licensing under the ITAR. So we'll see you at the front end of section 11.